So we now come to our next panel, which is going to explore the journey to cloud native. And I'm very pleased to introduce your moderator, who's Yesmean, and she is Principal Consultant at STL Partners. And I'm going to leave it to Yesmean to introduce the panelists. Yesmean, thank you very much.
Perfect. Thanks so much, Annie, for having me. And thank you everyone who's tuning in for joining today on this panel session, as Annie mentioned, on the journey to cloud native. So I'll be moderating today's session, and we've got, a number of esteemed panelists here, and I'm going to introduce them quickly and then allow them to give, themselves a quick intro, because, they can better share a little bit about their background and, the organizations they work at better than I can. So first off, we have Shamik Mishra, who is the CTO of Connectivity at Capgemini Engineering. Hi, Shamik, can you hear me?
Yeah, hi, Yesmean. Yes, I can. Can you hear me?
Yes, perfect. Do you want to just give a couple quick words as to your role and where you're coming from Capgemini Engineering?
Absolutely, and thanks for having me today. I am Shamik. I'm the CTO for Connectivity in Capgemini Engineering, and also I am the co-lead for our 5G and Edge offerings in Capgemini Group. I'm primarily responsible for the technology, strategy, and architecture of our telecommunications business, particularly with respect to connectivity in everyday life, whether it's the telecom operators, network equipment providers, enterprises, and industries. I work very closely in terms of what would be our current set of capabilities that we take to the market, but also quite heavily focused on research and innovation, on the future of networks and communication technologies as well. Yeah, I'm based in India and happy to be here.
Great, thanks so much. Next, we have Jeremias Wright, who is the Service Hub owner of the Cloud Center of Excellence at Deutsche Telekom. Hi, Jeremias.
Hi.
Can you give a quick introduction as to sort of your role and your background at Deutsche Telekom?
Yeah, sure. So yeah, I'm responsible for the Cloud Center of Excellence and driving the public cloud adoption in Deutsche Telekom, primarily focused on the IT side.
Perfect. And then last but not least, we have Oliver Korfmacher, so CTO of the Telecoms Group at ENEA.
Yeah,
Oliver,
thank you.
some quick words from you.
Thanks. I'm pretty impressed how you pronounce my name. It's actually pretty difficult. It was perfectly correct. Thank you for doing that. Yeah, I'm Oliver Korfmacher. I'm based in Berlin, Germany, and I'm overseeing the technology aspects of the telecommunications activities of ENEA, who is actually the Swedish company. And as some of you might know, the merger of various entities from OpenWave, Siemens, Cosmos, and a few others. And we're trying to focus very much on data layer topics here.
Great. So, I mean, as you can see, we've got a really interesting and different perspectives as well today. So I'm going to get right into it. I think the first question, and I want to point this in your direction, Oliver, we're really seeing, obviously, this topic is about cloud native, and we're seeing the move to becoming more software and code centric, the move to containerization, for example, and also just increasingly disaggregated technology, ecosystems, and value chains. What does this mean for the telecoms industry?
Yeah, I think this is actually very much in the center of it is that all the buzzwords in its respective forms. So cloud native, moving to Kubernetes, as NetNumber explained, moving to that architecture, basically opens for the telecoms or for the communication service providers, opens a multi-vendor possibility. So it's basically one way of getting to a point where you can pick and choose vendors and also change them on a much more frequent basis, deciding for this is the one I like, I want to have them for a few years and then change to someone else, or have more than just a dual vendor strategy, combining the different vendors. And without cloud native and all its automation aspects and everything that comes with it, that wouldn't be possible. So it basically allows a mix of bigger and smaller vendors, and that seems to me like one thing telecom needs to have.
And from some of the, I guess, engagements and conversations you're having with CSPs, do you see that primarily being driven from sort of an efficiency and cost element, or more sort of the move to greater innovation?
Actually, it's a bit of an unfair question. I'm kind of CTO here, so I'm looking more for the technology aspects. But of course, specifically the company that Jeremias works for, but of course everybody else, there's also always a discussion on cost. And the point is that by using the skills of the CSPs they have now developed to provide their own cloud infrastructure and everything, there's definitely a significant reduction. And that's why it even helps cost. And the sometimes frightened, or everybody was afraid about an initial cost that comes with the first deployment, even that is much better. And my personal view is that comes partially because 5G embraces IETF thinking in a sense. And the standardization of web interfaces or REST interfaces helped a lot to make it less painful than everybody expected in the first place.
And that's an interesting point as well. And Jeremias, I want to get your thoughts on that, because you come from an interesting background. You came from one of the large tech companies, and I think we mentioned the move to cloud native isn't just about the technology, right? There's also sort of a fundamental shift in the way that you operate. And so what has that journey been like for you and the team in terms of that that skills enablement and that transformation? Is there a goal to that, or is that just about sort of the process? Can you elaborate a little bit on that?
Yeah, sure. So so when I started in 2019 at Deutsche Telekom, there was no widespread public cloud usage, and the value of it was theoretically understood. And given that, an initiative was started to kickstart the usage. We made the decision to basically move the majority, in our case 60% in IT, to the public cloud. Right now we managed to get to a quarter, and this year will be challenging. But while of course we have individual success stories on the technology at hand, and they're of course exciting, what we've also learned is that this is also a journey from a transformation perspective, because what people did in the past to solve a particular problem and are doing in the cloud is somewhat different, similar to how the industrial revolution happened on the automotive industry, where of course you have a conveyor belt and assemble all the parts, and at some point all those robots appeared and you have to stop assemble things yourself and instead program the robot. And the same is of course happening to us, and we are currently finding exactly trying to find the balance between pushing some greenfield lighthouse projects where we do something really great, which was not possible using the cloud, and on the other hand, also enable all the teams in our organization to actually being able to use all those APIs, the cloud service providers, and that's why I'm always struggling on the CSP, are using or offering.
And going back to that analogy, as you mentioned, let's say in the manufacturing or the industry 4.0 space, it's around that convergence of IT and OT, and then obviously in telecoms, it's the NT. And Shamik, I want to point this next element to you, because as you mentioned, 5G and edge, right? So the bridging of IT and NT, where does edge fit into the balance, and what progress has the industry made from what you've seen in moving to cloud native in both, telco, IT, and networks?
Yeah, thanks, Yesmean. I think there are multiple areas that we have to look at in terms of 5G and edge and how cloud native comes together. So one of the fundamental problems we have in the telecom industry is that our ability to attract application developers to build applications that's meant for say 5G applications for verticals or edge computing applications. And the reason for that is the whole telecom ecosystem is so complicated, and it takes ages to get anything working on a telecom network. that is quite dissuading for application developers to come and try their luck in a MEC platform or an edge platform hosted by an operator. Now, that can only be solved perhaps by adopting some kind of developer experience, which is understood by the developers and they are used to it. And that's the hyperscaler model or the cloud native model. Now, having said that, it also means that the telecommunication network itself has to be secure, as well as it needs to be resilient enough so that applications can scale, as well as developers can have seamless access, plus different use cases, whether it's robotics or autonomous vehicles, or I don't know, I mean, private network use cases like smart manufacturing. All of this has a fair amount of requirements in terms of network resilience, latency, data privacy, security, as well as the ability of the use cases to run in different locations, whether it's on-prem, it's network edge, or even perhaps on the cloud. So the whole mesh of the network, applications, developers, the devices, the data that's getting transferred from the devices to the edge and to the cloud, it's not an easy task to accomplish. And one of the first steps perhaps is required to understand is where and what problem have to be solved at which location. So do we try to solve everything in the network edge? Most likely not. I mean, there are plenty of things that can still happen out of cloud. What can be solved on a network edge and what should be solved on an on-prem edge? I think those are fundamental questions that use case developers and enterprises have to answer. But the common model for all of this is to adopt cloud native, get to a model where it's easier for everybody to build an application or an architecture once and then repeat it over and over again across enterprises.
And it's interesting as well. I mean, some parts of that, as you mentioned, is, sort of the ability to scale, do that sort of quickly and be able to address customer opportunities, right? And Jeremias, what would you say are some of the key drivers from your perspective as to why this matters?
Matters what? Sorry.
I guess the shift to cloud, the key
okay.
Area of focus for you.
Basically, it's getting rid of the undifferentiated heavy lifting. So really simple example, let's say you have a typical basically contract closure and you want to figure out if it's fraud or not. In a traditional world, you then have to figure out about servers, virtualization, infrastructure, networking, virtualization layer, maybe Kubernetes, machine learning framework, and then really up to the point of training a model and then having real-time inference, or you just lose the cloud servers, put your labeled data in, and then have an API on every contract closure you can call and get the probability of fraud back. So, and of course, so that's a big advantage. And of course, you have to, on each and every use case, have to assess if it really helps. So especially I'm primarily from the IT side, so that's for me easier to set. If you go to the NT side, things are more difficult, especially from a network perspective. And there's also, of course, a lot of let's call it respect on dealing with the let's call them frenemies of hyperscalers. So, and the likelihood as closer we get to our core business, there might not be available the specific API of an hyperscaler that solves our problem, and that's where we can find our USP and deliver value here. But all the commodity stuff, for sure, the cloud helps. And what I'm always trying to say is so just looking at the amount of story points an engineering team needs to solve this problem. If you leverage cloud the smart way, you can considerably drop this to sometimes even a single sprint.
And I think that's an interesting point. And Oliver, I'd love to get your perspective on this because, Shamik mentioned a little bit about, trying to cater to, I guess, a whole new, ecosystem of developers, right? Which telcos, often have struggled in the past with. And, Jeremias, you mentioned also a little bit about, I guess, the ability to drive that simplicity, it sounds like, right? And instead of having or showcasing that complexity, it's how do you interact with these interfaces, whether that's via an API. And I guess, Oliver, from your perspective, given the focus area for ENEA, what do you sort of see as, the way that operators can, interact in a more sort of B2B to X type of, ecosystem-centric model, if you will? And what does that mean as well in terms of some of the areas that ENEA focuses on, including, for example, that data management and some of those, that 5G cloud native software?
Yeah, I think this, let me add one more thing, one more dimension, because we are seeing also the NT question is a very valid one. So we are seeing that the what to put into cloud native, so basically how and what to put in cloud native is also is different from operator to operator. So for example, smaller ones tend to move as much as possible to reduce their cost in maintaining the legacy. Larger ones are more selected, so they might keep stuff that is legacy from our point of view, so 2G, 3G. They might keep it in where it is because it's easier to give it some lifetime extender than to port it into a cloud. That very much, and that's of course an ENEA view, that very much depends on the adoption of a data layer. If you have a central data layer that serves maybe bare metal to cloud native front-end applications, maybe even beyond the pure data management applications, going into APIs for end users or for developers. If you have that in place, and that's why ENEA is focusing on this data layer topic a lot. If you have a data layer that is capable of serving virtual, bare metal, and cloud native, then we believe it's a bit easier for everyone to work with, yeah, because at least the persistency is provided by someone, hopefully us, of course, but by someone. Others can do that as well, of course. So this seemed to be helping the operators. But 1 second on your second part of the question. Of course, the enterprise, the adoption of enterprise non-public networks or private networks is also driving this. Here, the question is less on data layer, but more on slim automation, because otherwise you cannot do it. So this seems to be the trend here. And maybe there's no solution that solves all problems, but cloud native definitely helps to make it possible to deploy from 100 SIM cards to 100 million SIM cards. And that's obviously what needs to be done. Not talking about 5G as an Ethernet replacement, which we may also see in a few years, as was just discussed on the enterprise part.
Yeah, and Shamik, actually, I want to take that back to you because, to your point, Oliver, there's really, I guess, this question around, figuring out what do you, what that migration path looks like, right? Like, what do you replace? What do you rationalize? What do you migrate? And, it looks different for every single operator. And at the same time, there's a big focus on, 5G and edge and, leveraging that network programmability and, serving, new types of customers and partners and developers. What does that journey look like, Shamik? What do you think needs to happen for us to get, where we are today to that future vision?
Yes, and the migration isn't easy practically. I mean, the migration to cloud will bring several benefits. Perhaps you can have better scalability, better security, better visibility, more efficiency and speed. But at the same time, it's not trivial that we migrate stuff to cloud just like that. I mean, it's a long process. I mean, to a certain extent, applications which are deeply network aware or even network functions, for example, takes a lot of time in migrating, particularly if there are existing subscribers in it. And also there are risks involved in terms of how you migrate it. So obviously there's a path of evaluation of process of moving legacy applications to the cloud, and there have to be a fair amount of understanding of the long-term digital strategy of the operator. Does that really make sense to move to cloud? What kind of benefits that comes out of it? So the strategic evaluation or even a SWOT analysis of existing systems and the target system has to be done to a certain extent. Based on that, a lot of effort would go into the planning part. I mean, I wouldn't say a lot of time, but there's a lot of careful planning that needs to be done in terms of what resources should be allocated and what is the process that goes behind it. And also it's important to understand that automation first objective of any migration, so that the automation doesn't have to be recreated again and again. So while we are planning itself, the automation collection of data, how do we use data to actually make better automation processes going forward? Those are some of the things that we have to consider during the planning itself. And also we have to be very careful in terms of avoiding any negative impact on the ongoing business functions. And of course, it's important to also define KPIs in the planning stage itself, so that if there is a situation, then we can measure and monitor how the migration actually ended up in terms of performance. Choosing the environment is also a very important domain. What is the right cloud? What kind of cloud technologies to use? In certain cases, we might even have to completely refactor and re-engineer the application. There might be some hardware dependencies in certain applications. So how do we actually solve all of that? There could be certain architectures where the coupling of different components in the application is so heavy that it cannot be split into microservices, or even if it can be, then it's a hard-drawn process. It's also important to ensure that certain applications which are standards-based do not break the standards, even though they might. We traditionally believe that in cloud we can actually innovate and not really wait for standards to happen, but there are applications which follow standards, and if that application has to be migrated, then the standards model also needs to be enhanced. And then, of course, the question of expertise, and perhaps that is another complete new separate topic to discuss, whether the right operating model and the right set of skill sets are already there in order to do all of these complex tasks and ensuring the KPIs. But that also is part of the journey itself, to build the right team and to execute the right objectives.
And going forward in that, I mean, you talked about some of those factors that impact that decision making and that planning and that journey. How to what extent does that ring true to you, Jeremias, in terms of, I guess, the way that Deutsche Telekom is thinking about that? Are there any unique factors that are, let's say, applicable to Deutsche Telekom, and how do you navigate around those factors? I mean, you mentioned earlier that there is a goal to have 60% IT to the public cloud, and you're sort of underway in that. But what other considerations are taken into account?
So of course there's the basically, I think one driver is that IT was able to start more easily given traditional IT workloads, as well as some of the BSS related workloads. So that's why we started obviously with IT and not with NT. I've already mentioned basically the transformational aspects. And you mentioned already the cost aspect. That's also really important. And it's basically financing our transformation, because so actually we have a double-digit savings just on infrastructure costs moving this as is. That's already pretty great. But again, not why we're doing this. And then finally, and I think I want to underline this, taking this conference title to going to become a Techco, we have to apply the thinking of the tech companies. And yeah, having worked for one, like you sneak peeked, it's basically thinking about a problem and packaging up into an SDK or an API. And this sounds simple, but that's a huge step to do. And then of course, if it comes then to use the hyperscalers themselves versus doing something on the edge and having our own infrastructure for a valid reason, that's just changing the amount of work we have to do, but still how we doing it should stay the same by basically applying the methodology of the tech company. Everything is software. And if everything is software, we have to figure out ways to basically make it reusable and scalable, not in the old way of building or buying a monolith that then basically has to be ripped out completely and replaced by another monolith a decade later.
And I think as you alluded to as well, it's really around, the fact that, let's say, figuring out what the sort of the core USP is for an operator, and figuring out, where can you work with certain types of partners, including the hyperscalers and others as well, to fit into that equation and drive that. And, the industry has really talked about the future of moving to sort of a multi-cloud, hybrid cloud world. It's going to take some time in terms of, certain workloads that you move to the public cloud first, others that they may not. And I guess, Oliver, to you, I'd like to get your perspective on what you see as, some of the key areas that where telcos could play with this equation. What do you see as, potentially that core USP in it, if you will?
Yeah, I think it's still, and it's like 10 years ago, there's still a high credibility, a high level of trust to telcos, bigger than to the, of course I shouldn't name them, but bigger than the hyperscalers here, because by the hyperscalers, their business model is somewhat related to the data, to the subscriber behavior, and telco still gets money from providing a service. It's as simple as that, and it's still true in 5G, and I guess 6G will be still very much the same. So I think it's important for the operators to keep this level of trust by selling a service for money, and yes, finding an easy way to deliver it. There are also certain security aspects that still need to be maintained, and that's also a way how the simple thing like owning a SIM card, be it virtual E or whatever, still is a differentiator. Amazon has no SIM card. My Amazon account has no SIM card. My Deutsche Telekom account has one. So there's still a big difference. And finding the right balance here, leaning towards an IT structure, of course, but not completely taking it, because then you will become replaceable immediately. So, and as we know, all the hyperscalers are trying to establish an offering. They might give it a try in enterprise or somewhere else, but the consumer market might be next. So it's really important for the telcos to deliver a cost-efficient network that you can compete with them. It's pretty simple. And yes, you might need to adopt a bit of a multi-vendor scenario, a cloud-native scenario, where you can, as soon as you're unhappy with one vendor, switch to another, or find the right balance here. All that is very important. I fully agree to this monolithic part. But I think you should also keep some of your, all the credibility, because it's the key differentiator, as you asked.
And so, Shamik, what do you think successful, cooperation or co-opetition in a way looks like between, telcos and hyperscalers, and also, where other partners potentially fit into that equation?
Yeah, absolutely. I think this is a very vast space, and not everybody would have a piece of solution for everything. I mean, eventually there is a lot of possibilities of collaboration. There are certain things hyperscalers definitely do better in terms of creating ecosystems of application developers. They're perhaps more rapid in terms of platform development, in terms of end use case validation, and perhaps even to a certain extent, the business model itself, the whole consumption model was kind of pioneered by them. I mean, let's face it, if the whole app ecosystem wouldn't really have been there, if the application developer did not have easy access to computing resources in the cloud. So there is a very strong value that comes in from the hyperscalers, which I think can only help the telcos to expand their reach in terms of B2B as well as B2C businesses. From an application and from a business standpoint. Apart from there, from a technology standpoint, there are certain things in the telecommunications network, and I know this could be debatable and even controversial, where there is a possibility of reducing the overall TCO by adopting some aspects of the hyperscalers in terms of platform. Maybe it's more towards the core rather than towards the radio network. There could be certain aspects of the overall platform which an hyperscaler can give resilience. But at the same time, telecommunication is a regulated industry. It also has a certain amount of availability, and it cannot be a best effort network. It has to be always available network, and that requires a lot of, architectural resilience in the network itself, and also there are liabilities associated with it. So there are areas of collaboration between the hyperscalers and operators for sure. The technology companies, I think, has a very strong role to play here in bringing these two things together in terms of an application ecosystem, in terms of being able to deliver on very large scale automation, which sort of, and network automation is very different from application automation. A CI/CD for a radio network will be very different from a CI/CD for an application. But if we have a common base, a common platform, a common goal, I think the technology companies, Capgemini included, would be able to actually help here in bringing the best of the both worlds and try and solve very specific problems related to automation, related to application, related to data, related to better, more predictive networks. So that's how I think the collaboration would eventually pan out.
And to that point as well, I mean, Jeremias, we talked a little bit about those skills, right? And sort of that move to that. Is that, are you primarily sort of looking, is that around retraining or re-upskilling the teams within Deutsche Telekom? Is that also a degree of, hiring as well? Or what does that look like?
Of course, it's a bit of everything. So we have multiple initiatives. We call them academies to upskill and reskill certain sets of employees where this is feasible. Of course, there are different domains. So, for instance, targeting someone who has a tendency to like technology can be easily or upskilled on, for instance, doing something with no or low code. But of course, making a really software engineer out of it that a tech company would hire from the spot, that's a tougher thing. And of course, the percentage of people we can transition into that is not that high. That's why we also have to look at the other end of the spectrum and also hire this skill, which I think we all know is quite challenging on the current market, and then find means to multiply it.
Mm-hmm. So we've got a few questions from the audience that have come in. So I wanted to sort of point them to different individuals, our panelists here. So Oliver, I think this question I'm going to point to you. So, and also Jeremias, Shamik, feel free to, pitch in as well. The question here is, considering different technology stacks available to build a cloud platform and differences in what, vendors are, I guess, in a way, forcing operators to use part of their solutions. What is the experience and recommendations with regards to governance and also operations of all these different moving pieces?
Well, as far as we experienced in recent activities here, I think the first priority really is keep it simple. So the mess, if I'm allowed to say that, we are seeing in certain deployments of, I don't know, dozens of different cloud services, infrastructure service. There's quite a mess. It's quite a mix in both of flavors. And also there are always these people, system integrators, they want you to use their stuff. But the value they add might be too complex to really use it. So my advice or my also observation here is keeping it simple, reducing it to what really is needed, to essential bits and pieces, and that can be Kubernetes, as Shamik said. So it can be something like very straightforward solution for a problem. That seemed to be the most important thing to consider. We made bad experiences, as you can see, and that's why we believe the simpler it is and the less options one has, the better.
Yeah, and just to echo to what Oliver just said, I mean, if you look at the developer needs a working platform, as simple as that, a platform where applications can be built. And the more complex we make it difficult to roll it out. And we also make the life difficult for developers if we continuously change and add more content to it. Yes, of course, there must be a set of APIs and SDKs and other developer tool sets so that the developer can use the platform to the best of its capability. For example, in case of MEC, we in GSMA, for example, we have joined hands together to build a minimum set of APIs which a developer would need to harness the network's capabilities. So whether it's a set of network APIs or whether a set of lifecycle management APIs, but that's about it. We should let the platform be as simple as possible with an ecosystem of APIs so that a certain service can be delivered rather than trying to solve everything at one go. We don't want to make everything an engineering problem.
And Jeremias, are there any, I guess, principles that you sort of abide by with regards to, the governance and operations aspect of?
I think that's a tough one and highly debated also in our organization. Actually, we have two camps. One is basically siding to what has already been said, basically saying, so let's restrict ourselves to the lowest common denominator, and then you're portable, you can run it on the edge, on our own edge, and you can run it in the public cloud. But of course, you're losing a lot of the benefits. So for instance, for me, a hyperscaler, from my eye, feels like a giant set of APIs. I think the last time I counted, AWS amounts to, I think, 9,000 different ones. And if we're not using them, we are basically wasting a lot of potential. And that's basically the other camp saying, so as a software engineer, you can use the standard software best practices like abstraction and use the API for this particular use case on the one hyperscaler, and then replace it when you ever want to move to the other one. And honestly, between those two camps, there's no decision. And and actually, the Cloud Center of Excellence in our organization actually caters to both mindsets right now. And I'm curious on which viewpoint prevails.
Mm-hmm. Right, I think we have time for one more question. So this is from Ken. So to what extent will the adoption of cloud native alter the structure of the telecoms market? So, and then there's a few other questions in this as well. Will the hyperscalers dominate the telco Techco relationship? And, might standardization of distributed cloud squeeze the role of traditional network technology suppliers?
So maybe Jeremias should answer last. I think no. I think the hyperscalers will contribute. They will provide a platform, a service, something, but they will not replace them. I think the telcos are somewhat a unique beast, which will prevail and will remain. They might change, so in becoming more like the Amazons and Googles of this world, adopting some of their APIs and processes. Definitely yes. But I think there will be always, at least in my time, which might be shorter, in my time, they will be more than just a brand. They will be an operator, a service provider.
Yeah, and I agree here. I mean, there is no way, at least I don't see a hyperscaler actually replacing a telco. No way. I mean, that's really out of the question. I think it's a question of whether certain technologies would be better served by hyperscalers. I mean, if you had asked the question whether the network equipment providers can be replaced by hyperscalers, maybe, I don't know, maybe to a certain extent in some places. Would the platforms become more standardized because of hyperscalers? Yes. But then this is a very large, innovative ecosystem that we have. And if we just say that hyperscalers are the only way forward, then we are perhaps not doing a great service to all the innovative companies that are coming up with newer kind of business models and technologies. So I think there is a space for coexistence, and the best technology and the most resilient ones will win. I mean, in case of telco, resilience, I keep saying that because that's important in terms of performance, in terms of availability, and all the platforms that can serve that purpose, I think would have a place in the telecommunication world.
Yeah, so I think I can agree with this. The hyperscalers won't replace the telcos, but I think they will influence us heavily on how we're doing things, and we also will leverage them. So just looking at the recent things also on the 5G things on the offerings there and how you consume them just from the user experience, or on how to do a wide area network, that's something where we have to pivot and not do things like we did in the past, and carefully assessing to leveraging them or duplicating the business model. I think this is where it's impacting us for sure.
And to sort of a final follow-up to that question, I mean, we've seen some, early examples already of even, for example, certain operators sort of separating their, infrastructure business to their services business. And, we're seeing, I guess, increasing, I don't know if we want to call it sort of modularization, right? And the way that you sort of draw that line between, the infrastructure business and the services business is extremely fluid, right? That can be impacted by, for example, even things like Open RAN in the way that you sort of draw that line, or it's not sort of the traditional way anymore. Do we see that trend continuing? Let's say, with certain elements of the infrastructure being sold, let's say, to tower companies, and I guess more that focus on infrastructure or services or so on and so forth. Do you see that continuing, or is that sort of still going to be, a continuation of what's, currently in place, I guess, the traditional model?
I can go first. It might come in waves. So we may see definitely even more of a decomposition, so segregation of building blocks of the service. But there might also be in maybe in 6G or maybe even later a point in time where they all remerge. So where a very slim vertical complete operator challenges the deconstructed ones, and by providing a new service, a cheaper service, something else. So from my experience, it may change over time, but also can go not back to the big monoliths, but I think it can also be that a specific slice will be solved by one individual or by one operator, and because of synergy effects can offer a different or a newer, cheaper service. But it's my view, so it's not even probably not the official ENEA view, but it's a very good question, and it's I'm looking forward to see the answer. But I can imagine it comes and goes.
Yeah, and to a certain extent, I think it's we don't know that yet. There is a question of disaggregation, and say let's take the case of Open RAN. So a significant part of the mobile network operator's cost is the radio network. It has not been virtualized. The first time it's being virtualized. We all know virtualization does have an impact on performance, and it takes time to actually ensure that it goes back to the original levels of performance. Certain network functions, when they were virtualized or even containerized, you could actually live with a little bit of a lower performance for some time as you reworked on the overall performance. But radio network might not be so easy. Also, there is dependence of hardware. There is dependence on how the disaggregation is done, how the automation is performed. Is it more costly to integrate two different vendors' products than do it in one go from a single vendor model? So there are different questions, I think, that comes up. And then, of course, the system integration overall, there's a question of margin stacking. Each vendor adding their stuff on top of it might end up with a cost which is fairly complicated. But at the same time, in the long run, I think disaggregation will make sense if operators commit to very large scale disaggregated networks and disaggregated software, and they stick to it for several years. In the short term, I think there's going to be a cost spike because of system integration. In the long run, it might actually end up being more profitable.
Well, I'm sorry to break up the party because I thought that was terrific. So thank you all very much indeed. That was really insightful and nice to get beyond the very top level stuff we usually get. So thank you all very much indeed.